confession. I told you last week, and this is just going to kind of be the nature of us going through this together. I told you last week we're going to cover all of chapter 1 today. As I was prepping, I was like, yeah, there's no way we're going to cover all of chapter 1 today. Because, like we talked about last week, Jonah shows in a significant amount of parallelism between chapters 1 and 2, chapters 3 and 4. Now, except for, right, there's the excerpt, the later part of 4, which we called in the notes post-peak, that does not parallel anything else that happens. And really, that's where you begin to see Jonah's motive and why Jonah's doing what he did, etc. And so because of that, I really wanted us to slow down. So today we're going to be pretty slow. We're going to go through the text, realizing that after we cover this on the front end, when we're going through chapter 3, for example, it's going to be heavily parallel to what we're seeing here. And so we won't take as much time at that point. We'll kind of cover some things, but I want you to see in the text just the depth and the beauty from the book of Jonah. And so hopefully as you're going through, you're able to read the book of Jonah. Again, the challenge is to read through the book of Jonah once a week. So once a week, it's 4 chapters. You could read through the entire book in about 20 minutes in one sitting. And so, that would be my encouragement, to see really what's going on in the book as a whole. Any questions from y'all? All right. Well, let's just jump right into the text. So, we're going to start here in chapter 1, verses 1 through 4. Really, in your notes, if you saw that handout, if you remember that from last week, we called this the stage setting. So really setting up for what is about to happen. So you've got stage setting, chapter 1, verses 1 through 4. And then you have what's called pre-peak. So that's really where there's a rising tension, where you begin to see what's happening. And then chapter 2 is going to be the climax of this section. And that's going to be, what I'll use the word peak for. But that's going to be the climax of what's happening in this first part of Jonah. Then the second part, you'll see stage setting, you'll see rising tension, you'll see pre-peak, and then you'll see peak, and then you'll see post-peak. But we'll explain through that as we go. So in your minds, think through Jonah 1 and Jonah 2 as one major unit, and then it breaks down. So let's look at the first 4 verses, God's commission and Jonah's silent escape from God's mercy. So God's commission and Jonah's silent escape from God's mercy. So let's read through all of chapter 1, and I'm going to read the first phrase of chapter 4. Now the word of the Lord came to Jonah, the son of Amittai, saying, "Arise, go to Nineveh, that great city, and call out against it, for their evil has come up before me." But Jonah rose to flee to Tarshish from the presence of the Lord. He went down to Joppa and found a ship going to Tarshish. So he paid the fare and went down into it to go with them to Tarshish, away from the presence of the Lord. But the Lord hurled a great wind upon the sea. So look at right at the beginning, chapter 1, verse 1. Now the word of the Lord came. So notice that right out of the gate, there's no warning, there's no stage setting that's happening. It just comes right out of the gate and says, now the word of the Lord came. And it just launches into this journey that Jonah and that we as readers aren't necessarily anticipating. So you're reading the book, boom, right out of the gate, now the word of the Lord came. This is the only time in all of the Bible, that this phrase occurs right out of the gate in a book. Okay? That this formula starts out at the very beginning of the book. This unusual introduction highlights the sudden and unexpected nature of God's commission that we see. So notice right out of the beginning, now the word of the Lord came. Boom. First time we ever see that happening. And the phrase, the word of the Lord, or literally the Lord's word or Yahweh's word, occurs 242 times in the Old Testament. I don't have a pencil for this thing, or or else I would write on it. But it occurs 242 times in the Old Testament, especially in prophetic literature. So most of those occurrences happen in prophetic literature. And with very few exceptions, the phrase introduces this oracle that a prophet is to convey on behalf of a particular audience, usually Yahweh's covenant people. So he's saying, on behalf of Yahweh's people, here's the word of the Lord, right? That's usually how this happens in prophetic oracles. Here, it's different because it introduces this royal commissioning directly from the Lord to his servant Jonah. Does that make sense? That difference that happens? Usually it's to a larger audience that's happening. What's significant here that we see when the word of the Lord comes is it's coming directly to Jonah. Okay? Now to Jonah. Now the word of the Lord came to Jonah, the son of Amittai. Jonah, it identifies his father. So his father's name, Amittai, appears to derive from the noun which literally means truth or faithfulness. So if you look at the root, the Hebrew root word, it comes from the noun truth or faithfulness. Amith is literally what that Hebrew word is. So amith, Amittai, amith would be the noun form. And it's followed by an abbreviated form of the divine name Yahweh, which really, when you put it together, Jonah's father's name would be something like, Yahweh is faithful, the Lord is faithful, the Lord is true. And so, isn't that ironic? As we're going to get into more of the book, his own father's name is, the Lord is faithful, the Lord is true. And so I believe that the author is intentionally drawing this out for that purpose, but also, as we talked about last week, this mention of Jonah's surname clarifies that he's the same prophet that was mentioned in 2 Kings 14:23-25, right? We read that last week. It's situating who Jonah is and what's happening here historically in the people, in the history of Israel, in the history of the people of God. And it clarifies that he's the same prophet who predicted Jeroboam's successful expansion of Israel's borders. And this anchors the story to that historical situation. So no details don't matter. All details matter when you're reading the biblical text. So now the word of the Lord came to Jonah, the son of Amittai, saying, now here we're introduced to direct speech from God, saying, arise, go to Nineveh, that great city, and call out against it, for their evil has come up before me. So as is often the case, and I didn't want to take the time to do this, but it's interesting. If you look at this calling commission that happens here in Jonah, it's very similar to other prophetic calling commissions that happen all throughout the Old Testament. So if you look at Exodus, the Lord calling Moses, you're going to have almost side-by-side comparisons of how the Lord is going to call somebody. So the Lord's oftentimes going to call somebody, and then the person which they're calling, the prophet, is going to shy away from that calling. They're going to say, no, Lord, it's not me. And then the Lord's going to rebuke them verbally, and then they'll eventually go and do what he does. So this is very similar here. So the Lord's saying, arise, go, call out against. So as is often the case, there's a sense of urgency. This imperative, when it says arise, literally it means up. So like go, arise, get up. And when this is linked with other commands, so you've got this imperative, arise, up, and then you have two other commands. What are those two other commands in the text? Go. And then what's the second one? Call out. That's right. So when this word up or arise is linked with other commands like go, call out, it's usually showing this exclamation. It's showing the force of this imperative. So here's the function, And it's saying, go quickly, like arise, go, get up. And what are you to go do? You're to go, and you're to call out. That's right. I love how the NRSV translates this verse, or translate this phrase, and it captures the idea really well. It says, go at once to Nineveh. Go at once to Nineveh. Is anyone else using a translation that's not the ESV in here? You have an NIV? How does the CSB translate? Get up. So similar kind of. It's meant to convey this urgency. Arise, get up, go. And now, do you remember last week we talked about one of the key features of Jonah's book is this thing called textual information gaps. Textual information gaps. That is when you'll get this part of the story and you'll wonder, where's the other information, right? So you'll be oftentimes, as a reader, left wondering, why? Why is Jonah supposed to arise? Why is he supposed to go out and call against, what's going on? And so notice how this happens all the time in Jonah. And the reason for this urgency, the reason that it's urgent, is going to become clear in the causal clause that follows the actual commission. So arise, go to Nineveh, right? Go to Nineveh. Now, does anyone know what Nineveh is or where Nineveh is, the significance of Nineveh? Mm-hmm. It's in Assyria. Anything else? Any other familiarity with Nineveh? It's the capital city of Assyria. Yes, it was. Okay, good. So the identification of Nineveh as the Lord's target audience is significant for two reasons, right? So why he's saying go to Nineveh has two significances. Number one, right out of the gate, a prophet being commissioned to visit and to preach to a foreign nation was unprecedented in Hebrew prophecy. In Hebrew prophecy, usually you're saying, come and see, right? So you're saying, come into the people of God. Let us care for you. Let us care for orphans. Let us care for the poor. Let us have these opportunities to bring in the nations, outsiders. In Hebrew prophecy, it's uncommon for there to be this commissioning to go visit this foreign nation. Now we see that flipped in the New Testament, right? So in the New Testament, it's not come and see, it's go and tell, right? In the New Covenant. So most prophets delivered oracles of judgment to foreign nations. But they did so oftentimes rhetorically as part of their message to Israel to serve as heralds of deliverance from foreign oppression. So this is what the book of Obadiah, this is what the book of Nahum is about. They're often used to warn Israel or Judah of the disastrous consequences of dependence on foreign nations. That's going to be Isaiah chapter 13 through 24. Or finally, they're used to humble Israel by reducing her status of one of the nations in need of the Lord's judgment. So Amos. So against this backdrop, the Lord's commission to travel to Nineveh and deliver an oracle of doom directly to the nation in question is completely unique. This commission breaks new ground in Hebrew prophecy. It's unlike any of the other prophecies that we see in the Hebrew Bible, this going to a foreign nation. So that's reason number one. Number two, Nineveh, though historically a city of some renown, was not, during Jonah's time anyways, the capital of Assyria. Now, it eventually became the capital of Assyria, but it was not the capital of Assyria during that time. The capital of Assyria throughout the 9th and most of the 8th centuries was Kalhu, modern Nimrod, okay? So that was the capital throughout the 9th and most of the 8th century, usually when you would date Noah, or Jonah, not Noah. Later in 717 BC, Sargon II established a new capital at Dur-Sharukin, which is modern Khorsabad. And only after Sennacherib ascended to the throne did Nineveh become the capital of the Neo-Assyrian Empire. And so, nevertheless, Nineveh is treated as this representative city all throughout this book, right? This representative city of the growing Assyrian Empire, despite the fact that Kalhu actually served as the administrative center. So then the question needs to be asked, well, why? Why this urgent call, right? It's urgent, arise. Why is this urgent call given to go to Nineveh? Go to this more peripheral city of Nineveh, although it eventually become the capital. Why did Nineveh warrant God's and consequently Jonah's attention? Well, this is where you let your Bible help you. Yep. That's right. And you also allow what you see in the Bible to help you understand what significance is happening. Sorry, I'm getting super hot. The tradition regarding Nineveh's origin is recorded in Genesis chapter 10, verses 11. Genesis chapter 10, verse 11. And this offers a very significant clue. The text says, "From that land, Ashur emerged and built Nineveh, that is the broadest city, and Calah, as well as Resen between Nineveh and Calah, which is the capital city." So interestingly, Nineveh heads the list of cities attributed to Assyria's ancestor, right? So Assyria, the list of cities that are attributed to this ancestor Ashur implies that Nineveh was one of the first great cities that was founded when Assyria was founded. So Nineveh was very closely related to the origins of Assyria as a nation, and frequently it was used to represent Assyria as a whole, as well as the Assyrian ideals of imperial expansion, national pride, and indiscriminate use of power. God's charge for Jonah to travel to Nineveh is rich with the symbolism of Assyria's origin and her reputation for unrestrained cruelty. So you understand historically where Nineveh is coming from, even beyond the fact that she's eventually the capital in Syria. And so Jews, Israelites, they know their Bibles. They know the historical situation. So Nineveh's association with Assyrian cruelty, do you think it made it a really exciting place to want to go to? No, that's right. Not at all. So it was very undesirable and an even more undesirable audience for Hebrew prophecy. So the whole point of prophecy in Israel was to warn of impending judgment in order to encourage repentance and avert disaster, right? That's the whole point of prophecy. Encourage repentance, avert disaster. In the case of Assyria, however, few could believe that anything good whatsoever could come from this ruthless enemy of Israel and Judah. So, arise, go to Nineveh, that great city. So this phrase, that great city, that's a loaded phrase. So this description is great, can anticipate the city's rise to prominence, like the capital aspect during Sennacherib's reign. This phrase occurs in 3 other places in the Hebrew Bible outside of Jonah. It occurs in Genesis 10, verse 12, Joshua 10, verse 2, Jeremiah 22, verse 8. Each time with reference to a city that serves both as the capital of a district or nation and an important cultic center. I believe this could also have anachronistic use, reflecting the perspective of the author on his audience. It emphasizes the Lord's anticipation of the resurgence of Assyrian power and the plans that he has for the city, right? The Lord's going to use Assyria in very significant ways for the people of God, right? It's through this people that he's going to discipline his own people, Isaiah 10. I believe that great city, which you'll see allusion to in chapter 3, after Jonah gets swallowed in the belly of the whale, you'll see this phrase again. Certainly has implications describing God's special love for them, right? It describes God's special love for them and by proxy, God's love for the nations. To lead them to repentance. And also, I think a careful reader of the Bible should match this description with the spies' description of the Canaanite city that so intimidated them in Numbers chapter 13, verse 28. So Numbers 13:28 tells of 10 spies that report to the people, and the cities are well fortified and very intimidating. So this aspect of great can have these various meanings. Like Nineveh is going to become a great city in the history of the world, and God's going to use it for his purposes to discipline his people, out of which they will come out. Secondly, the love for which God has for the city and the nations by proxy. And third, just the this might sound simplistic, but just the greatness of the city, like how big it is, how fortified it is. All right, you're doing good. Stay in there. And be thinking as we're going, I want us to pause. That's why we're going to hit 4 verses right now. And then we're going to pause. We're going to do some reflection, think about application, and then we'll keep going. So arise, go to Nineveh, that great city, and do what? And call out against it. That's the second verb. That's right. And call out against it literally means to condemn it. So go to Nineveh, that great city, and condemn it. The final imperative in the series is condemn, call out. This verb to call out, to cry out with this preposition against, connotates disapproval and warning. So the Lord is disapproving and warning them. And this is the climactic command in the Lord's commission, right? The trip to Nineveh is merely prerequisite. So going to Nineveh is a prerequisite to the main task of publicly expressing God's holy wrath against that city, right? So you are not just to go to Nineveh, but you are to call out, you are to condemn it, you're to give a warning against them of God's holy wrath against that city. Now let's finish up the phrase. For their evil has come before me. For their evil has come up before me. So why is God saying to go to Nineveh, that great city, and call it against it? What's the purpose? What's the rationale? Because they're evil. That's right. Because their evil has come up before him. Nineveh's wickedness had reached a critical point, and God's intervention was needed. So Yahweh, the Lord, expressed the state of affairs through this interesting and rare idiom. Their evil has come up. Their evil has ascended before me. And this idiom suggests this racking up of offenses, this collecting of offenses until the Lord can no longer abide in the wickedness. And at the end of the day, it emphasizes the blatant nature of Assyria's crimes, which they had shamelessly put on display. And just an asterisk, as we're reading this and as you're thinking about this, don't just think that Nineveh is the only one who's blatantly sinned against the Lord. That's right. So the Lord's justice can wait no longer. The purpose clause, because, or for, in your Bibles, you see that for, it's a purpose clause, expresses the reason for why immediate action is needed. And this recalls the hint of urgency in the exclamatory arise, right? So Jonah is told to arise, which means what? Get up. Does that mean like nice and chill, like relax, like just take your time, take a cruise ship over there? No, that's right. What does it mean saying? It means go now. That's right. And why are you to go now? That's right, because God's wrath is about to come upon them. That's right. And what are you to do when you're there? You're to call out against it. Tell them that God's wrath is coming. God's wrath is impeding. Good. Okay, trying to wake you up. Let's go. All right. Now, evil. This word evil, I want to make a mention here. We're going to come back to this throughout the next 4 weeks. This word evil that's used here can have a really broad range of meanings, in Hebrew especially. So it can refer not only to human or mortal evil, but it can also refer to as natural disasters. We'll see this in the book of Jonah. Harm or injury, troubling times will be using this word ra'ah in Hebrew, which is translated as evil. Negative emotions, divine acts of judgment are sometimes translated with ra'ah. And so here the term clearly refers to human wickedness. So the wickedness of the people has come up before me. Their evil has come up before me. Any questions in those first 2 verses? Are you seeing the setup? This is still stage setting. All right. So that's the commission of the Lord. This is Jonah. This is what you are to do. All right. So usually in prophetic commissionings, like I said, and just for the sake of time, we didn't do this, but you could go side by side. If you want to do it, I'll give you the texts that correlate in the book of Exodus especially. God will commission his servant, his prophet, and they will say, no, I can't do it. Oh my, God will rebuke them, and then they'll go. Jonah's going to be a little unique. So here's what happens. God commissions him. Verse 3, what does he do? But Jonah rose to flee to Tarshish, right? God says, arise. He said, I'm arising. I'm going this way. See ya. So Jonah rose to flee to Tarshish from the presence of the Lord. He went down to Joppa and found a ship going to Tarshish. So he paid the fare and went down into it to go with them to Tarshish, away from the presence of the Lord. So, but Jonah rose to flee to Tarshish from the presence of the Lord. Like I said, just to reiterate, divine commissions in Hebrew narrative are typically followed by the reports of the addressee's. Eventually, it'll be the addressee's obedience in terms that exactly parallel the wording of the commission. So God will say, do this, and then the person to which he tells them to do will match up exactly what God had said, and it'll parallel each other. And the initial verb, and this is why I tried to draw this out when we're reading, Jonah rises, right? Yahweh says, arise. The Lord says, arise, get up, go. Jonah gets up, right? So as a reader, you're like, okay, he's obeying. He's being obedient to the call of the Lord. It echoes the imperative of the Lord's call, up, arise. But these expectations are immediately dashed, right, with the purpose clause that follows. But Jonah rose to flee. He doesn't get up to carry out his commission from God. He doesn't get up to obey what God has just called him to do. He gets up to go the opposite way. He gets up to flee. Now, the reader should expect a verbal objection here, but it's replaced with direct flight. And oddly, the author of Jonah, he gives no explanation for Jonah's disobedience. So you don't know why he's doing what he's doing. Right? In the text, we don't know that yet. We just know that this is what he does. The focus right here in the passage is firmly fixed on his actions. The silence regarding Jonah's motives is likely intentional. The author is doing something with that, keeping it intentional. Again, why? Why do you think the author is keeping it intentionally, leaving out some details? Well, what is this called? What do we keep calling it? What was it? The what? Stage setting? Well, information gapping, right? So intentionally leaving gaps in information. So it's intentional. And the author's suppressing information, leaving out some information. where the reader expects it, desires it, thinks that it should be there, in order to reveal it later. Oftentimes when it's least expected, for more climax, if you will, when you're thinking story. Like, oh, well, that's why he went and did all that. That makes sense. Maybe it doesn't make sense, but we'll get to that later. This technique, information gapping, builds suspense, and in a way, it's meant to expose our prejudices and our own assumptions as readers, right? Because we're wondering, why is Nineveh doing this? Or why is Jonah doing this? I keep mixing up Jonah's name with everything. I'm sorry. I keep saying Noah, Nineveh. Why does Jonah keep doing this? Because we're not going to know Jonah's motives until chapter 4, verse 2. We're not going to know why Jonah does this until chapter 4, verse 2. But the author directs our attention to Jonah's actions and their consequences. So, though Jonah's motives remain hidden, like we don't know why Jonah's doing this, what is clear in the text? Jonah rose to go where? To go to Tarshish, right? Yep, so that's clear in the text. Jonah's destination is not at all questioned. His eyes are set for this place called Tarshish. Now, the thing I love about these Sunday school classes, you can go a little deeper than in many settings. And so the precise location of Tarshish, and I just frankly did not have time to get a map out, but the precise location of Tarshish is still uncertain. So there's really three locations that they believe generally Tarshish would be in. They're all in the same direction. It's just a matter of okay, if this is Jerusalem and this is Joppa, here's the sea. Is Tarshish here or here or here? So it's all the general kind of destination. And so suggestions include Tarsus in southwest Spain. This is a Phoenician colony along the Guadalquivir River. Another suggestion is Carthage, or a town on the island of Sardinia. So take that as you will. It's those kind of details like you can go write a research paper on. And it'll be fun. So arguably more important than its exact location, however, is Tarshish's general orientation and associations. So Tarshish is generally associated with the West. You see this in Genesis 10, Psalm 48, 72, Isaiah 23. It's associated with the West. And it thus lies in the complete opposite direction of Nineveh. Okay? So that's what's being communicated. It's the complete opposite direction of Nineveh. And it indicates what about Jonah? What does it tell you about Jonah? That's right. He's going as far as he can. He's going the polar opposite direction. God says go to Michigan, and we're going to Alabama. Like that's what's going on. And so, furthermore, Tarshish is this distant and exotic location. So, this place occupying the very edge of Israel's geographic awareness, in a sense. According to 2 Chronicles 9:21, a round trip to Tarshish required 3 years. It would take you 3 years to go there and come back. It was considered well worth the time and travel and trouble, however, because Tarshish had precious metal and exotica. So there were things there that were excitingly different. So you go there, have a fun time. Its distance from Israel and Nineveh probably proved attractive for Jonah. Made him want to go there. Like, let's go this polar opposite way, kind of on the outskirts. But I believe most significant for Jonah was the fact that Tarshish was known as a location where the Lord had not yet revealed his glory of his word. Tarshish was a place that the Lord had not yet revealed his glory of his word. So in a sense, like, it could serve as this refuge or this haven from disturbing and unwelcome commissions like the one Jonah had received. Let me go to this place where the glory of the Lord in his word has not yet come. Let's escape there. Tarshish's reputation as a place not yet graced by the Lord's glory and revelation is also underscored by the phrase from the presence of the Lord, right? You see that clearly in the text. Notice that this is the true goal of Jonah's flight. Why is Jonah going there? To get away from God's presence, right? To flee from God's calling. Banishment from his unique experience of divine presence. Which, when you think about a prophet, you're like, what in the world is going on, man? Oh, my goodness. All right, so we as readers, we should be careful, though, not to misconstrue Jonah's flight as this, simplistic, foolish attempt to find a place beyond God's knowledge or sovereignty. Like, we can think, oh, that's what Jonah's doing. Well, that's not necessarily the case, because Jonah later confesses, literally in verse 9, a few verses down, that the sea and dry land are the Lord's domain. Like, I know that all of this belongs to God. Jonah knows this, and at no point does he seriously entertain the possibility of eluding the Lord's omnipresence. Rather, Jonah seeks to escape the revelation of God experienced in a particular place where he chose for his name to dwell. He wants to get away from that. All right, so he's Jonah, where's he wanting to go? He's wanting to go to Tarshish. All right, now how's he going to get there? Yep, he goes down to where? Joppa. He went down to Joppa. If you're an underliner or a circler in your Bibles, a couple great places would be to highlight, and we're going to draw this out in a minute, to circle the word arise. The Lord calls Jonah to arise, to get up, and you're going to see Jonah keeps going down, right? Jonah went down to Joppa. He's going to go down into the ship. He's going to go down in the belly of the whale. All right. He went down to Joppa. Jonah begins his journey by heading to Joppa. Joppa was located almost due west from Jerusalem, like right here. Here's Jerusalem. You go right to Joppa. And it served as the main station for travelers and merchants making their way to the region of Syria, Palestine. In the 8th century, Joppa is not believed to have been under Israelite control, but was the position of Sidkiah, king of Ashkelon, is historically what they believe. Scholars believe. So notice the irony, like Jonah was already outside of Israelite territory when he arrives to Joppa, and he apparently has no aversion to Gentiles there, per se. He readily enters their territory and seeks their assistance to go the opposite way, to flee from the Lord. Notice how the author, as I said, describes Jonah's journey to Joppa as a descent. Jonah descended. He went down. This is this characterization that will define the entirety of Jonah's attempt to escape, marked by the repetition of the verb. It's going to continue to say, he went down, he went down, he went down. As an author, he's cluing you into a detail. Like you want to see that Jonah's going the polar opposite. God says up, I'm going down. The author's choice of this verb is significant because it contrasts the initial imperative in God's commission to Jonah to arise up. Where's the Lord summoned Jonah up, Jonah responds by going down. And this contrast underscores the conflict between the Lord and Jonah. Now, the verb to go down also points to the potential result of Jonah's flight. Jonah's descent moved in the direction of death, right? To going down, moving into the direction of death, the direction of Sheol, and brings up these images of the grave, of death, of Sheol. And Jonah's going to pick up on that in chapter 2. So thus, though Jonah, his geographical orientation, he's moving west, right? His geographical orientation is west. The author of Jonah is making it very, very clear to us that Jonah's spiritual orientation is downward. It's moving in the direction of death and chaos and opposing to the Lord. Much more is at stake in Jonah's flight from the Lord's presence than simply dodging this undesirable task. There's a lot more at stake that's going on. All right. So Jonah rose to flee to Tarshish from the presence of the Lord. He went down to Joppa. And what did he do at Joppa? He found a ship going to Tarshish. So upon arrival, Jonah gets over to Joppa. He locates a ship that's about to sail over to somewhere over here. We know it's westward for Tarshish. And notice how everything about Jonas, just to remind you, notice how everything about Jonah's action is diametrically opposed to Yahweh's commission, to the Lord's commission. Everything is diametrically opposed. All right, so he found a ship going to Tarshish. So what did he do? He paid the fare, and then what did he do? He went down into it to go with them to Tarshish, away from the presence of the Lord. So Jonah, he had to pay for his passage, so he paid the fare. And he hired the ship and its crew for the long journey before boarding. Ancient Jewish tradition suggests that Jonah had to rent the entire ship for his journey. Whether we know this or not, the implication is that Jonah, in his haste, spent a significant amount of money, one way or the other, for the ride, and probably its crew. Different ways, right? Significant cost. Notice that disobedience in your life is oftentimes more costly in more ways than one. Disobedience is oftentimes going to cost you in more ways than one in your life. The author, once again, so he paid the fare, went down into it. The author again emphasizes the downward orientation of Jonah's flight by stating that Jonah went down, descended. Thus, Jonah's continuing disobedience and its consequent danger remain in our view. So the author's trying to show us something as readers. He's wanting to see, see how this is opposing the Lord's calling. See how this is continuing. The recurrence of this verb as a description of Jonah's boarding the ship may well foreshadow the depths to which he's about to fall in the next episode. The same verb is used in Psalm 107:23. Let's read that. That's a good one. Psalm 107:23. And this is indicating trouble at sea from which only the Lord can rescue. This psalm. Same verb used here. Psalm 107, I'm going to read in verses 23 through 27. And this is indicating the trouble at sea from which Yahweh, the Lord, can rescue. All right, here we go. Some went down to the sea in ships, doing business on the great waters. They saw the deeds of the Lord, his wondrous works in the deep. For he commanded and raised the stormy wind, which lifted up the waves of the sea. They mounted up to heaven. They went down to the depths. Their courage melted away in their evil plight. They reeled and staggered like drunken men and were at their wits' end. Then they cried to the Lord in their trouble, and he delivered them from their distress. He made the storm be still, and the waves of the sea were hushed. Then they were glad that the waters were quiet, and he brought them to their desired haven. Let them thank the Lord for his steadfast love, for his wondrous works to the children of man. Let them extol him in the congregation of the people, and praise him in the assembly of the elders. The psalm makes the same association between descent and the near-death experience at sea as found in Jonah chapter 1. The near disaster of this next episode is anticipated in Jonah's downward trajectory. So as Jonah's moving down, you anticipate that things are going to get worse. In fact, the author reiterates the prepositional phrase, away from the presence of the Lord here, to ensure us that we would remember the true goal of Jonah's flight. What's the true goal of Jonah's flight? Why is he doing this? To run away from God's call to prophetic service. Okay, one more phrase. Let's see the Lord's rebuke. Verse 4, the first part of verse 4. But the Lord hurled a great wind upon the sea. But the Lord hurled a great wind upon the sea. I'm gonna stop here and we're gonna discuss briefly. And I'm gonna show you why I'm stopping here afterwards. Jonah 1:4 pauses the narrative, right? Pauses the narrative to highlight the Lord's response to Jonah's flight. It's hard to see this in English, but in Hebrew, and if you want to see this, I did bring my Hebrew English interlinear so that both of us can talk the same language. In Hebrew, the grammatical subject Yahweh or the Lord is moved to the front of the clause. So whenever in ancient languages they're moving a word to the front of the clause because the way in which their languages work are a little bit different than ours. They'll move it to the front of the clause, followed by a verb that conveys action that's simultaneous with Jonah's flight. So you can think of it as like, meanwhile, so as this was happening, meanwhile, the Lord flung, or the Lord hurled. Okay? So as Jonah's doing this, the Lord is doing this. Okay? Simultaneous action. That's what's being meant to convey. I refer to Psalm 107. 107. Yep. So this construction is shifting attention abruptly from Jonah's actions to the Lord's actions, indicating this escalation in the tension between the two, okay? This tension is getting bigger, wider. Again, as we talked about last week, I'm not one to say like, all of you need to know Hebrew, etc. No, like that's why they're teachers in the church. But see, and the English I think does a pretty good job. But in our chronological minds, we can think like, progression. And this is seeking to communicate like this is what the Lord's doing simultaneously as Jonah is seeking to turn away. All that we're really seeing in the text is that really what's happening simultaneously is Jonah going down into the ship to go with them to Tarshish. And that as this is happening, the Lord is hurling this great wind. The Lord is starting to turn the pressure up a little bit. Now, in terms of I think that's probably the best indicator of time. That's right. Enough time for him to get down, and again, there's some information gapping that's happening because we're gonna get more information as we keep going. That's gonna fill in some of that. But so the objection stage of a call narrative is normally followed by a divine rebuke, in which the Lord rejects the excuses offered by the chosen agent. In the case of Jonah's calling, why I want to kind of highlight his uniqueness in some ways, Jonah's unconventional, i.e. nonverbal, objection provoked an unequally unconventional and nonverbal rebuke from the Lord, right? Jonah does not verbally reject the Lord and his ways, and the Lord non-verbally rebukes Jonah. No, it's interesting. It's crazy. Yahweh, the Lord, conspires with the wind and the sea to foil Jonah's attempted escape. The verb, you see this in your Bibles, the verb hurled or flung calls to mind the throwing of a spear. Is usually how this is used. So it's meant to convey this throwing of a spear, hurled the wind, and suggests in some ways that the Lord's assuming this role of divine warrior, right? And the projectile of choice is the wind and not a spear, right? The wind serves as the Lord's weapon and expresses his wrath at Jonah's rejection of his commission. Now, wind often serves as a divine weapon, either in defense of the Lord's covenant people. What's the most common instance of defense that utilizes the wind and the sea? The Red Sea. That's right. Exodus. Good. Or the wind can be a divine weapon as an instrument for their chastisement, for their discipline. I've got a billion verses listed out right here. I'm not going to read them all. Look at Exodus 15, Psalm 48, Isaiah 27 for a few. The wind and the storm it provoked was kind of like Yahweh was sending this warning shot with a bow, like, Jonah, you're not going to get away from what I'm calling you to do. And the Lord's response to Jonah's flight sets in motion a chain of events that launches and sustains the next episode that we're going to get into. This is evident in the repetition of the verb hurled throughout the next unit. The word hurled is going to be used in chapter 1, verse 5, chapter 1, verse 12, chapter 1, verse 15. And notice how the Lord's hurling of the wind toward the sea eventually results in the mariners hurling Jonah into the sea. So the Lord is hurling the wind, and the mariners are going to hurl Jonah right into the sea. And the point of this chain reaction is that the Lord has orchestrated this chain of events. The Lord has orchestrated a series of events that places both Jonah and the mariners entirely at his mercy. The Lord is sovereign, right? This clause ties together the first episode, chapter 1, verse 1 through 4a, and the second episode, chapter 1, verse 4b, through all the way through the remainder of the chapter together, and it's tied together by this catchword, hurled, ensuring the recognition of the Lord's persistent call as the common denominator. Notice, all right, finally, before we pause, notice that it wasn't just an ordinary wind that the Lord hurled towards the sea. What was it? What's the adjective? A great. That's right. The Lord hurled a great wind. Now, the author of the book, where have we already seen this? The great city. That's right. Nineveh was identified as a great city. The author often employs the same adjective. Never mind. The same adjective occurs 12 more times in the book. You're going to see great here, great here, great here. Chapter 1, verse 2, verse 4, verse 10, verse 12, verse 16, verse 17, chapter 3, verse 2, verse 3, verse 5, verse 7, chapter 4, verse 1, verse 6, verse 11. And it's always with reference to obstacles that Jonah had to confront and overcome. Jonah had to confront and overcome Nineveh, the wind, the storm, his own selfish anger, his own selfish joy in some ways in the Lord. The frequency of the adjective throughout the book may underscore the daunting nature of the divine call and the challenge it presented to Jonah's unconventional thinking about God's sovereignty, how he shows mercy, and who he shows judgment to. All right. We have made it through 3 and a quarter verses. So let's pause for reflection. What are reactions or areas of application or kind of feedback from this section that is drawn out from the text? Yeah, I would be interested. That's a good question. The word itself is trying to convey this flinging, this hurling, this throwing. So different translations may use different verbs there, but I would assume that those translations are going to be consistent in the verbs that they use. Does that make sense? So when you look at, and again, it's conveying the same truth, but it might be hard to see kind of the consistent repetition of vocabulary. That's interesting. Yeah, the Hebrew Bible makes it clear as day. Depending on your translation, depending on its more literalness or seeking to get more readability, it might translate a little bit differently. But I think either way you get there, it just might be a little harder to make the connections in some ways. Yeah. Any other thoughts? What are some applications from this section? Yeah. That's right. So you're kind of expecting it to go wayward right out of the gate. Yeah. Which I love how the ESV draws that out. Like intentionally is trying to show you as a reader he's going the opposite way. No, and so it's just unique. You know, Jonah's way of seeking to avoid God's call is a little unique. But you see examples of this with Elijah. You see Moses doing this in some ways, especially verbally when God calls him at the burning bush. Now I believe that Jonah is the only one who blatantly seeks to go away from the presence of the Lord. There are others who will disobey or not do according to what God's calling them to do, but they won't be seeking to go away from the presence of the Lord. So we'll get into Elijah here briefly, and we'll see in ways that Elijah tried to avoid God's call or not obey it completely. But instead of going away from the presence of the Lord, he just went back to the mountain. He just went back to Sinai. But even there, that's where you see comparisons between Elijah and Jonah. I keep wanting to say Noah. Golly. That's right. Different boats. Any other thoughts? Yeah. And his heart is so hardened towards the Lord showing mercy on the nations. It's like nationalistic thinking that Jonah has that even we can have in some ways. Any application that you can draw out from here for your own life, right? God is clearly sovereign over all things. That's right. This speck of dust right here, God's sovereign over it. Yeah. Any other application? Or that God has intended for all people. God desires for all people to be saved, and we think it's an inconvenience to us to go share the gospel with them or to go out of our way to spend our money to whatever it might be. Yeah. Just a few that I wrote down. This aspect of living before God's presence and God's presence that you see drawn out, like Jonah fleeing away from the presence of the Lord and God's sovereignty over everything, this concept of living before God's presence. Jonah's flight underscores the truth that it is sometimes uncomfortable to live in God's presence, right? You see this in Jonah and ours, like it can be hard, it can be uncomfortable in some ways to live in God's presence. Now that's the best place for us, and God's using it, and that's how we ought to live. But if we're honest with ourselves, God's uncompromising challenge to show mercy even to our own enemies that he calls us to in Matthew 5 can be frightening. It can be overwhelming. It can be frustrating. So notice that it can even drive us into hiding, like Jonah. Like we'll try to do everything we can. Like, is the Lord calling you to share the gospel with that coworker? Has the Lord called you to do that? Yes. Do you intentionally try to avoid it by going into a different cubicle? Yeah, I mean, you're no different than Jonah in some ways. All right. Jonah quickly discovered, however, here you go, catch this. The presence that he fled was the very presence he needed. The presence that Jonah was fleeing was the very presence that Jonah was needing. The only alternative to living in God's presence and embracing the challenge of the Lord's call is to descend into chaos and death. And that's what we're going to see in this next scene. Jonah may have thought that he was heading for distant and exotic locations, places, i.e. Tarshish when he flees from the Lord, but in reality, he's only heading to the grave. And how true is that for us in the world, right? All right. Secondly, the wages of sin and the free gift of grace. You see this clearly in this passage. The fact that Jonah had to pay for the vessel and the crew to carry him away from the presence of the Lord contrasts sharply with the provision the Lord offers to those who submit to his commission, right? For example, when the Lord commanded Elijah to flee across the Jordan, he provided his prophet with water from the Wadi Cherith and food from the ravens, free provision. When the wadi dried up, he sent him a widow of Zarephath who met his needs by the means of the Lord's provision. You see the story, 1 Kings 17. Similarly, Jesus commanded his disciples to journey without staff, without luggage, without wallet, without food when he sent them into their first kingdom commissions, Luke 9 and 10. And disciples sent to do the Lord's work enjoyed divine provision. Jonah, however, must pay for his own transportation provision in his rebellious flight. Sin is costly. Disobedience is costly. You have free gift of grace in Jesus. Finally, fleeing your calling was the third kind of thought. Jonah, this is kind of picking up on your question, Stan. Jonah is not the only prophet who fled his calling. Elijah also fled his ministry when Jezebel threatened his life after his great victory over the prophets of Baal on Mount Carmel. Well, yeah, he's afraid of Jezebel, and he doesn't believe that God's going to care for him, give him all that he needs. So he's going to put his own life in his own hands. Yeah, so the magnitude of it's certainly different. Now, Elijah's flight, obviously, however, was toward the mountain of God. Elijah fled to the mountain of God, Sinai, where he sought to receive fresh revelation, right? Elijah sought refuge in God's presence, not escape from God's presence. That's where it's different from Jonah, right? He sought refuge in God's presence. Jonah sought to escape God's presence. Jonah's flight was in a very different direction for a very opposite purpose. He sought to escape from both God's revelation and God's presence. Both prophets, however, in the Bible are rebuked for their flight. Elijah's rebuked, Jonah's rebuked, and they're sent back into the fray of their ministry. The two stories serve as a reminder that ministry and living according to God's way in a sinful world can be hard. Ministry can be difficult because God's people, all of us, can face opposition. Outside of the church, clearly, and even in some ways inside of the church, unfortunately. In the face of such opposition, even faithful servants are tempted to retreat to this closed-off spirituality, this just me and God, I'm just going to retreat away from the people of God. And secondly, ministry can be difficult because of the demanding nature of the Lord's mercy that God's servants are called to live out and proclaim to unsavory and undeserving people like us, right? That was us. Like, there can be people in our lives that we're like, man, you just frustrate me so much. Like, I don't know if I can share the gospel with you. But then you remind yourselves, like, that was me. You know? That was me. So thankfully, God's response is loving correction, reassurance, and redirection back into the service of God. I can't help but think of Peter, right? Peter's denial of Christ. Peter denies Christ. And in a lot of ways, I love this picture of John, or in John chapter 21, where the Lord is restoring Peter back to like, you are my son, like you are my disciple. And he feeds him a meal, and they have this like agape dialogue or love dialogue where Peter is asked 3 questions from Jesus, like, Peter, do you love me? Okay, feed my sheep. Peter, do you love me? Feed my lambs. Peter, do you love me? Peter gets sad because Peter remembers, like, I denied Jesus 3 times, and the Lord restores Peter. So, guys, like, ministry can be hard. Living as a disciple of Jesus can be hard, but notice that God will sustain you. God is sovereign. God will care for you.